My name's Jim Ludes. I am Vice President for Public Research and Initiatives and Executive Director of the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. And it's my distinct pleasure this morning to present Senator Jack Reed, who's going to introduce the guest of the moment. But let me just say a couple of words. I know you heard from Senator Reed last night, so I don't need to belabor this. But it's exceptionally rare in Washington, D.C. To find a U.S. Senator who is so widely regarded on both sides of the aisle. But that's Jack Reed. It's a result of his careful consideration of issues, his dedication to the men and women of the United States military, and his integrity. And those of us who live and work in Rhode Island know just how lucky we are. So with that, Senator Reed.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. But I want to first thank you not only for willing to participate and be our moderator today, but also for your great work at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. It's a great asset for the state and for the nation, so thanks so much. And I'm really pleased to welcome my friend Tom Donilon. Tom is a Rhode Islander, a bona fide Rhode Islander, born in Providence, raised in Providence, went to LaSalle Academy, which I went to. He was a couple of years behind me. And I think we both learned there that be able to stand up and be yelled at because, because the one thing that would not happen to you in public life, in the Army or elsewhere, is you wouldn't be hit. At LaSalle, the brothers hit you. So you could always in the back of your mind say, well, I can yell as long as he wants, but I know he's not going to punch me like Brother Jerome. Okay. So that's a great educational advantage that we both have. And Tom, I think, has demonstrated much more of that advantage than I. You all know he was President Obama's national security advisor at critical moments in our history. One of the most was the attack on Abbottabad and taking out Osama bin Laden. That was orchestrated, coordinated, yes. Tom was a key element in that operation. But he worked with President Carter in the White House, and then he served as Assistant Secretary of State and Chief of Staff of the State Department under President Clinton. And so he came to the White House job of National Security Advisor with extraordinary experience, both as a lawyer, as an official in the White House previously, and then, of course, as a State Department official. Today, he is still decisively engaged in national security policy, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation. He's a member of the CIA External Advisory Board. He's a member of the Defense Policy Board, and he chairs President Obama's Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. And this might be one of the most significant and important endeavors ongoing today in Washington, and Tom is there. And in his spare time, he is with the law firm of O'Melveny, where he's the vice chair. So without further ado, my friend, my fellow Rhode Islander, my fellow LaSalle, go Rams, Tom Donilon.
So the way this is going to work is I'm going to get to do my best Jimmy Fallon impersonation this morning, after some period of time, we're going to open the floor to questions. So keep those in mind, and we'll come to that in a minute. So, Mr. Donilon, let's start with the White House Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. Can you give us just a brief update about where the work stands?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, Senator, thanks for that introduction. I invited here in August to Newport. Didn't expect to see so many ties and suits, so I guess it's an unusual event here reflective of the national security industry in the United States. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be here with so many individuals and companies that contribute to the nation's security, where we have really some of the great technology and doctrine being developed by the people in this room. It's a pleasure to be here today. On the the commission, the National Commission on Enhancing Cybersecurity. The president put this together, named this commission in February, and we're on a short time frame. We're scheduled to give a report to the president December 1st of this year. And essentially the way we have conceived this is really a transition memo for the next president, setting forth those things we think that the next president should address over the next 5 or so years with respect to cybersecurity. The President Obama will review this in December, and then again we'll present it to the next president of the United States. It's born, of course, out of a number of things. One is that the volume and sophistication of cyber threats against the United States government, against our economy, and against us as individuals is growing pretty dramatically in terms of sophistication and volume. And that's only going to increase. You know, we have now, and a number of people in this room are involved in this, the physical internet, the Internet of Things, becoming quite prevalent. And that's going to put tens of billions of devices online. It's going to increase the attack surface that's vulnerable for us pretty dramatically. And this has to be addressed now, trying to get this right from the start with respect to security. You know, it's interesting, if you talk to the folks who are deeply involved in the formation of the internet in the first place, right, coming out of DARPA and the Defense Department, they'll tell you that security was not the focus, right? Security and privacy was not the focus of these of internet development. And so we've had to catch up with respect to security on the internet through a variety of technologies and doctrines as we go forward. Our effort here would be to try to get this right from the start, as I said, with respect to the kind of this expanded attack surface. It also grows out of, the Commission grows out of a recognition that we have a variety of threats. We have the classic threats against cyber espionage, state-to-state espionage, and the threats of war fighting. But we also have an ever-expanding cyber crime threat. We have state-sponsored cyber-enabled theft of intellectual and other property. We have insider threats. I know a number of people in this room deal with cybersecurity initiatives. This is one I don't think gets enough attention, I think, with respect to the threat, which is the insider threat, trusted insiders, and the threat against your cyber assets. Vendors and your relationship with your supply chain, obviously, is a series of threats. And employees, you know, through they're not engaging in effective cyber hygiene. You know, most of the studies show that 70 or 80% of the breaches could be prevented by really core, fundamental kinds of cyber hygiene. And if we could get that implemented in the first place in the government, which is where I'll get to the Commission in just one second, and throughout our systems, we would be able to concentrate on the more persistent, serious threats from states, essentially. 70 or 80% could be prevented, I think, through the adoption of kind of core cyber hygiene practices. On the Commission, Jim, a number of topics. One, the federal network. I think, you know, my personal goal would be to have a set of steps taken where we can move the federal network, the .gov network, and that's where we're focused, not .mil, on the .gov network, to a place where it's a model, not a problem. And I think there are a number of steps that we can take to do that. That's about roles and responsibilities, clarity of roles and responsibilities in the government with respect to cybersecurity. Second area we're looking at for, I think, a series of important initiatives is on workforce. Now, people in this room have to deal with this all the time. There is a significant shortage in this country with respect to engineering assets, engineering workers, right, and expertise. You know, it's interesting, and there's a market failure of some sort here. You know, the cybersecurity engineers, I'm told, can be hired at a 20% premium over engineers typically in their area, and generally in the area, and yet we have a shortage. That's a market failure of some sort, and I think a national initiative with respect to increasing the availability of cyber talent, right? Both, by the way, in the private sector and the public sector. It's a real problem in the public sector, which we can talk about. The Internet of Things, I think, as I said, will be an important focus. I think there's a number of things we can do here with respect to product assurance and attestation. We're looking at critical infrastructure, state and local. We can talk about that maybe a little later. We have a state and local problem that's been in the newspapers on voting systems, right, which has been in the newspapers in the last 24 hours. Research and development priorities and information sharing. So it's a broad look at things. Again, we'll try to come up with, I hope, 10 or 12 signal initiatives for the next president to enhance our cybersecurity. I think it comes at an important time. We've got a great commission of really incredibly technically proficient folks.
So I know that just in the last couple of weeks you've asked for input, public input from from industry and others on novel approaches to increase security and resilience of infrastructure and new technology. So to this room of technology leaders, what's the kind of input that you're looking for?
Well, I think that essentially we're looking for the for the best ideas to address the problems that I laid out. So on federal systems, right? Thinking hard about the technologies and approaches that can better protect them. I think there are a number of things. By the way, I also think it's interesting. Although we are asking and are looking for the best technology ideas, the best technologists in the country that I've talked to also talk about this as a very human problem too. This is not just a technology problem. This is in any organization. It's a leadership and culture and accountability problem. What we've seen, I think, in the private sector over the last few years is really significant increases in the ability of companies to protect themselves, because it moved from just being the IT person's problem to being the board and the CEO's problem. That's been a significant change. I think we need to make that change in the government, by the way, with respect to having leadership, accountability, cultures, security cultures in the government. So it's about people as well. It's about systems. It's about management as well as technology.
So there's been considerable discussion of whether or not the federal government needs a Chief Information Security Officer, CISO. Can you share with us your thoughts on that issue?
Well, we have a CISO in the Office of Management and Budget named Tony Scott, who oversees this. But I do think it's and we're looking at this hard. I do think we could work towards a couple of things. As I said, leadership and accountability and a kind of a culture of security. One of the things, just as an aside, that we're working on here is also considering a public education campaign. We've had in this country a number of successful public education campaigns that have contributed to safety. We haven't had a successful campaign with respect to cyber to this point, and I think we can. I think we can look at kind of the successful campaigns we've had to date and how to replicate those going forward.
And maybe we bring Senator Reed into this question too. You mentioned press accounts in the last 24 hours indicating that voter rolls in 2 states were hacked. The press accounts, anyways, link that hack to, or those hacks, back to Russia. At the same time, there have been a lot of media discussion of Russia's involvement in the hack of the DNC emails. What can you share with us about what's happening and what this tells us about the broader relationship with Russia and the role of cyber and all of that?
Well, we are waiting for the relevant agencies, the FBI, all the defense agencies and ultimately the White House to indicate definitely who is the culprit, but all signs seem to point to Russia, whether it is a state-sponsored or state-encouraged or what manifestation, but it seems to be Russia. Then the question is, and I think this is honestly one of the things that's slowing down the public attribution, is what do you do? And that's a tough set of issues. And I think the latest issues of states show not only the vulnerabilities, but this behavior can't be tolerated. It's going not to just something peripheral, but right to the core of our electoral process if they continue to pursue this. So I think, and Tom, I think, has a closer sense than I would, but once you have attribution, it begs the question, what are you going to do? And I think right now we're in the phase of we think we know who did it, what are we going to do? And I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, sure. Again, and the government has not made a public statement with respect to attribution. But if you look back at it, Jim, one is that a number of private companies, CrowdStrike and others, who are reputable forensic cybersecurity companies, have indicated that the intrusions into the DNC were most likely by entities that have been historically associated with Russian intelligence. Those are the public reports. The Russian denials with respect to interfering in electoral processes or not engaging in cyber activities, of course, are wrong, right? And demonstrably wrong, right? I mean, Russia has engaged in cyber activities globally for a while. You start publicly with in Georgia and Estonia, right? And right up through the annexation of Crimea and the invasion into eastern Ukraine. The proposition that Russia doesn't engage in trying to upend political systems, right, or political discussions, right, is also wrong, right, and demonstrably wrong, I think, in Europe. And indeed, I think what we've seen with respect to Russia in recent years is a real increase in information warfare and information operations generally. This was, a big part of the takeout, the annexation of Crimea was a big part of the annexation of Ukraine. Now, those were really multi-dimensional, covert kinds of hybrid war operations. And information warfare was an important part of this. And this, of course, is a historically important part of Russian activities generally. And I think that's what we're seeing, frankly. I think that we're seeing, kind of this is a subset of information war and influence and propaganda efforts around the world, including perhaps in the United States here, in terms of interference. Russia. It's interesting. Just one comment on Russia generally. We went through a period from the breakup of the Soviet Union, really through Putin's coming back into office in the spring of 2012, where great power relations were constructive and productive generally, and that period, we got a lot done, frankly. And when I say that, I mean that there was not a hostility. There was an overt hostility between and among the great powers, between the United States and China, the United States and Russia. There are obviously disagreements, but it was generally a productive and constructive atmosphere. I think that has changed pretty dramatically with respect to Putin coming back into office. I saw Putin on the Friday night before he was inaugurated in Moscow in the spring of 2012. And it was clear then that he intended to take Russia in a different direction. These ideas of spheres of influence, balance of power, zero-sum outcome, real sense of grievance, and kind of a sense of trying to restore Russia to being a great power player were palpable with him, right? And we had a period for the prior four and a half years with his predecessor, we'd made a lot of progress, right? Putin had decided to take Russia in a different direction. Indeed, the 25-year period where we had worked very hard to integrate Russia into the security and political institutions of the West, he's pulled away from, right? And I think he considers himself in a competition, and in some ways a conflict and a hostile posture with the West, and it's become a much more difficult relationship. Now, last thing I'll say is he's playing a bad hand, right? Russia has terrible demographic problems. In 2016, Russia will have a contracting economy for the second year in a row. It's under sanctions from the United States and Europe, which have had an impact on it. It has been battered by low oil prices because the Russians have never been able to expand their economy beyond basically being a commodity-driven economy. But nonetheless, Russia can be its spoiler, right? And it's obviously an important actor in the world scene, and one that's going to be very, I think, quite challenging for us going forward. But there's been a distinct change, I think, and we have to really regard ourselves here, right, in a much more different posture with respect to Russia than we were in, because I think Putin considers himself, again, kind of in an actively hostile posture with the United States.
Does the United States need to adopt a declaratory policy on cyber? So if we are able to get attribution, do we need to name and shame consistently? So when Sony was hacked, the White House itself identified North Korea as the actor. The White House did not do that when the Las Vegas Sands Corporation was hacked earlier that same year. Do we need a consistent policy of attribution, naming, and shaming when state actors are involved in hacking of American entities?
Well, I think one thing we have to recognize is that we can't operate alone and individually, that we have to have an international consensus or guidelines. If we do operate alone, it lessens our leverage. If we operate together, it increases our leverage. So part of what this process is going on is not only internally looking at how do we strengthen our own policy doctrine, but also to develop with our allies, the Europeans and others, sort of consistent rules of the road, so that when there is a security breach or a cyber incident, that we will have a doctrine and we'll have a policy that is not unique to us but is embraced by the world, and the offending country is clearly outside the pale. In some respect, it's a parallel with what we've done talking about the Russians, the sanctions, the European sanctions against them for their behavior in the Ukraine. If there were unilateral U.S. sanctions, if we called them out, said we're going to do bad things, that would have been nice. But when you had all of Europe coming together and consistently, they not only suffered financially, they suffered in terms of their international prestige, and they were the ones in the world opinion who was seen as they should be, as the violators. But one other point I want to circle back to, which Tom made about what he has to do for .gov. We've got to be able to fund all that .gov improvement. And again, last evening I spoke about ending sequestration. If we simply end it for DOD and we don't have the resources in the other area, and I'm talking about health, education, and welfare, I'm talking about every agency, we're gonna have a back door wide open. And just two quick points. Before the Appropriations Committee, where I'm a ranking member on Transportation and Housing, we asked each IG from HUD and from Transportation, what's their biggest concern? Cybersecurity. All the data they have, all the information they have, and they don't have the resources to like DOD sometimes says, well, we're going to plug in $100 million to do cyber and get us up to speed. That's way beyond their ken. So that's something else. But again, my instincts, but I'd be more impressed with Tom's comments, to be a declaratory policy would have more resonance if it was an international policy, not unique to the United States.
Essentially, on the resource side, no doubt that in the .gov space that agencies regard cybersecurity now as being essential to the accomplishment of their mission, and it undermines the mission when we have these problems. And we have a lot of work to do on the .gov side. On the declaratory policy issue, Jim, that's a complicated question, and it has a lot of layers to it, right? So, when is an attack an act of war requiring a U.S. response, right? My own instinct is that I would look to apply kind of the physical world, kind of international laws of war to the cyberspace. On issues like these kinds of hacks, right? What's the right response, right? And there are challenging issues of attribution, and then, as the senator said, there are issues of response. My own view would be, I think you have to have a base of kind of peacetime norms, that what's on, what's off, and then calling out, I think, is important. With respect to China, for example, and this is very different, right? China had, for a long time, really paying no cost, had engaged in massive state-sponsored cyber-enabled theft of intellectual and other kinds of property in the United States, probably from companies in this room, for an extended period of time. We had, and this is the kind of thinking that you have to go. It's complicated, multi-layered thinking. We had this go on for a long time. Again, the Chinese were paying no cost on it, and essentially regarded as part of their economic development program. I gave a speech in the spring of 2013 calling the Chinese out for the first time on this. And then we engaged in a set of interactions, right? And we now have a dialogue trying to find those things, as the senator said, which are not allowable, right? Which are not, trying to find some common interest there. I think with respect to Russia, if in fact we were able to make a definitive attribution, I do think that given that the interference by Russia, if it turns out to be the case, and the United States electoral process is way off, right, and not acceptable, and it is something that I would think we should publicly call them on, frankly. For another reason as well, and that is, it's interesting, these stories in the last couple of days, again, without knowing what the definitive attribution might or might not be, but it points to another vulnerability, right? It's not just the theft of the stuff, the theft of the information. We also, and Jim Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, has pointed to this in his last couple of major presentations in front of Congress, we're also looking at manipulation and degradation of information, right? Which can have big impacts if you think about in the context, for example, of an election.
There's a million places we could go with this. Mr. Donilon, you've recently been named co-chair of Secretary Clinton's transition team. I'm just going to marry that with your role on the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. A growing number of federal CIOs are political appointees. How do you assure continuity on cybersecurity across administrations when political appointees lose their jobs on Inauguration Day?
Well, I separate out these roles, right? Yeah, you're pushing me. I'm not going to push them together. We have built in the federal government, I think, a very strong cadre of professional cybersecurity experts. As I said, one challenge today and for the next president is going to be to continue to have and be able to attract first-class cyber talent into the government. And the federal government obviously has a number of challenges here. It has challenges with respect to the difficulty of hiring federal employees, which can be a difficult set of hurdles to get over. It has to compete on compensation, and I think that it's a big problem for the federal government and a challenge for us. I think we've been fairly successful. I think maybe more successful than you would have predicted, frankly, because I think there are in this country really talented engineers and other science and math oriented folks who are patriots, right, and who find working on these problems that everybody in this room deals with really interesting, right, and have the ability to make a contribution. So we have some advantages with that respect. But I think that this is a strong cadre, Jim, of professional cybersecurity professionals in the federal government. That's the first point. The second point is this: is that whoever the president is, right, in 2017, he or she is going to be focusing on this problem, right? The cybersecurity is not a partisan issue, right? Indeed, we have portions of the commission that I chair were appointed by the Republican leadership, right? It's a thoroughly nonpartisan issue. So I don't think it really has any political attributes to it, frankly. I think that, if you are the President of the United States, no matter who he or she might be, you're going to have the same interest in not having major breaches on your watch, right? On improving the federal networks, on seeing that the country has enhanced practices, right, that make sense, investing in the right kinds of technologies, right? This, by the way, I'll finish up on this. This is something we are focused on. We have, my own judgment, been going in the wrong direction with respect to basic R&D research funding in the United States, and it's historically, one of the great attributes of the American system has been this marriage of the federal government and investments in basic research, working closely with industry and tied closely to academia. And that triangle, right, of interest, right, working closely together has been one of the keys to us gaining the technological leadership we have in the world.
Changing course a little bit here, Mr. Donilon, you played a crucial role in the Obama administration's rebalance, refocusing some attention on America's Pacific relationships. How do you assess that rebalancing? Where are we now? What's the work that still needs to be done?
There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So this is Jim's talking about kind of a strategic decision that President Obama made when coming into office. It really was based on this assessment. So President Obama comes into office in 2009 and asks our team the following question, as you would if you came into a company, right, that you were taking over, right? Where are we underinvested and where are we overinvested in the world? And the determination was made that we were overinvested in military operations in the Middle East and that we were substantially underinvested in terms of national assets in Asia across every dimension, diplomatic, military, economic, mind share, doctrine development, right, and it was, at the very same time that we were, by necessity, deeply engaged in really multiple wars in the Middle East. You had one of the greatest economic transformations in history taking place in Asia at the exact same time. And so the president made a determination that we would, with Secretary Clinton, Secretary of State, that we would rebalance assets and invest more assets across all those dimensions of national power in Asia. And indeed, it was not, by the way, people date it like a 2011 and things like that. It was 2009. Hillary Clinton's first trip as Secretary of State was to Asia in February of 2009. She was the first Secretary of State to do that since Dean Rusk in 1961. So there had been a determination from the outset to invest more deeply in Asia. And you ask, how's it going? Right? I think we've actually made quite a bit of progress with respect to it. You know, we're on a path to have by 2020 60% of our naval and air assets globally invested in Asia. And Ash Carter's been working this very hard. We have become much more deeply involved diplomatically in Asia, including the president becoming deeply involved in the East Asia Summit and participating more directly. We've invested deeply in the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, with the president seeing the leadership from ASEAN every year since he's been in office. Our allied relationships in Asia are much better now than they were 7 or 8 years ago. And if you look at the relationship we have now with South Korea and Japan, it's just at a much deeper level. This has been at the same time, by the way, where we have been pulled in to obviously having to deal with these challenges, terrorists and other challenges in the Middle East. So we're a global power, and we're always going to have these pressures. But I think we've actually making the kind of steady progress you make with a strategy. Challenges going forward, there are at least 2 or 3. One is, we have a continuing challenge getting the relationship with China right. It's the most important relationship we're going to deal with in the 21st century. There's lots of dynamics here, including, by the way, the historical dynamic, which would tell you that historically, for the last 500 years, when you have a rising power and an existing power, in many cases this ends up in conflict, right? So managing that, I think, is critical. And then North Korea. This, in my judgment, will be potentially a first-class crisis, where you have a regime that is, obviously one of the most isolated and unpredictable regimes in the world that is developing, across 3 dimensions steadily. Nuclear weapons developments, miniaturization of those weapons, and the ability to deliver them through intercontinental ballistic missiles. And if we get to a place where they have fully developed those capabilities, that's not an acceptable place for the United States and not an acceptable place for any U.S. president.
Sobering. So one of the key components of the rebalancing was trade. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership has become a bit of a hot potato this political season. We don't have to litigate its merits now. But from where I sit over at the Pell Center, and as a sort of a general look at the public's appreciation for trade as a good that benefits the United States, that needle seems to have gone in a fundamentally different direction than where it's been in the last 40 years. What is missing in the public debate around deals like TPP, leaving the details of TPP aside?
Okay, great. I'm happy to take it on. Well, no, it's an important question. It's one of the it's one of the fun. It's one of the it's been one of the biggest issues in the campaign, right? I think a couple of things on this. Number one, you're right. The TPP was an important part of Asia strategy. But during the course of this campaign, there's been a lot of pressure on trade policy, this is a result of a number of things, including very real economic anxiety in the country, and a questioning as to whether or not we have adequately accompanied our trade opening initiatives with programs and support for and recognition of the difficulties that significant segments of American society have had, these concerns about trade among segments of the American people are real, and that's been the challenge, right? And we have, if you look at it, Jim, you look at the and it's not all due to trade, right? But if you look at the wage assessment, right? The wage growth or lack of growth, right, over the last 30 years. If you have a college degree and an advanced degree in the United States, over the last 30 years or so, you've done pretty well in terms of median wages in the United States. If you have less than a high school degree, or you have a high school degree in just some college, you've seen your wages in the last 30 years drop between 15 and 25%. You know, these are really serious issues, right? And there's been some of that impact is because of trade, and I think in the lack of kind of a focused policy to kind of purposefully address these impacts. So I think that it's obviously been a big issue in the campaign. It's going to be a real challenge for the next president to develop approaches which are responsive to the kinds of impacts I talk about.
Well, I think Tom put his finger right on the major issue, which is the genuine anxiety of the American public about their economic security. And they see it as a result of several factors, one of which is trade. And frankly, it's easy to point to jobs that once were in, you know, Woonsocket, Rhode Island, or West Warwick, Rhode Island, and now those similar type jobs are in China and Vietnam and other places. I think that's one factor, but another factor, which is, and again, you want to do the analysis to sort of give the right weighting, is technology. It's just extraordinary proliferation of technology, which starts making jobs less valuable, so that you don't get the compensation that you would assume you've gotten even 10 years ago. Then, of course, there was the shift, not just a shift, the collapse in 07 and 08 with the financial crisis, and many people have not recovered. In fact, you know, their whole savings were literally in their homes, and those homes are still undervalued. So you have all these factors coming together, and I think the reason trade is such a prominent way it sort of quickly summarizes a host of issues, but this anxiety is real, and the question is, how do you deal with it? I think one is, and both sides are talking about this, but one, we do have to sort of reinvest in our infrastructure because of several reasons. One, it puts people to work rather quickly, and many of these people are the ones who are suffering from the fact that, you know, if you have a master's in electrical engineering, you're doing okay, but if you're a high school graduate who works very hard with manual skills, you're not doing okay. That helps a lot. Second, it makes us more productive, better roads, better bridges, less time, traffic, et cetera. And the other thing that's happening too, I sense, is that people are very astute. They know what's going on, and they're looking and trying to figure out, okay, things are tough now, but what happens when we have autonomous vehicles? And I read where 10% of jobs in the United States are related to driving a vehicle. The UPS delivery, just getting things, the bus drives, et cetera. What happens, and they understand, because technology has been so robust and so fast in terms of changing everything we thought would never change, that they say 5 years, 10 years from now, you know, will there be will my good Teamster job be there? And that's a real question that's nagging at them. And in terms of most people, it's not just about you and me. What about my children? I've got a job here that maybe I can hang on till I'm 55, 60, and you know, go on to something else. But that job won't be there for the next generation. These are real serious points of anxiety. And again, trade is one of those slogans that you can trigger all these emotions. And that, I think, is what's happening on the political dynamic today.
But I mean, but it's real. You know, if you look at the, and again, I'm a national security person, not an economist, but the you know, the impact of China's entry into the WTO and an extension of its manufacturing on jobs in the United States has been very real. You know, and the latest assessments that I've seen have been, you know, indicated that some significant percentage of the manufacturing jobs have been attributed to kind of to Chinese activity. I think that I think the senator has exactly right. It may be the most important public policy issue facing the country is how do we have economic growth? How is it better dispersed? and what is work like in a globalized and technologically advancing world, and what's the social contract that we put in place to allow for fulfilling work over an extended period of time that allows you to provide for your family in its future. That really is it's the fundamental public policy issue, and we need a policy response. We've seen the anxiety in the campaign, and part of that response, I think, does have to be a major infrastructure plan.
And I think, frankly, you know, many people have said, and the foundation of our military strength is our economic strength. And without economic strength, our budgets can't grow enough to fulfill all the requirements we've talked about and we'll talk about tomorrow, too. So that's the key. And I think it's also the sense of giving people this, a real sense of opportunity, that it's still out there, that I can still find it, that this enterprise works for me. Again, one of the recurring lines in the whole sort of debate going back and forth, the system's rigged against me. 20 years ago, I think most people sensed that, you know, the system was working relatively okay for me. It can be improved. So we have to change that. It's not just a perception, but we have to change the reality too. Wages have to go up, and then through competitive markets, we have to have opportunity for all of our citizens.
So we're at the point now where we're going to open the floor to questions from you. So there are a couple of microphones that can come around. So if you got a question, put your hand up. The mic will come to you. And just remember, a question ends with a question mark.
Jim, thank you very much. Senator, Chairman, and Vice President, thank you very much for the great panel. Pulling on the theme of the comment that Mike Mann brought up earlier on the elections, and Director, you brought up as well on the election, or Chairman, on the elections, we don't have a national policy regarding cyber. Every state, and in fact, in Rhode Island, we've done it with the help of Jim Ludes in the Pell Center, the Rhode Island State Police, Captain Alfred's here, CVS, many institutions, both public and private, were involved in doing that. But we have a patchwork quilt across the United States of cyber data breach laws. So Senator and Chairman, can you talk to the promise or the possibility of really getting a national policy? And I think from an elections perspective, it's every state. So if we're going to fix this, it's going to be on a state-by-state issue until we have a national policy. So your comment regarding a national policy on cyber, whether it's just cyber data breach as a starting point. Thank you.
I think that, you know, we're a society that in a form of government, there's a federal system, right? You know, and there are certain parts, including the election system, which is assigned under the Constitution to the states. With respect to kind of national policy, I think what we can do at the national level is to identify best practices and identify the kinds of things that, and set a good example, right? And have help from the federal government in protecting those things which are really critical infrastructure and other systems which we are concentrated on. You know, state and local governments have real cyber challenges. And I think that, you know, one of the things our commission is thinking about and talking about is how can we best assist states and localities kind of getting up to kind of best practices with respect to a variety of their systems. I think the election system presents a special case, and we now, I think, have a really kind of a red flag being raised here with respect to vulnerabilities. But that is under the federal system. That's a state and local responsibility. So I think we can identify best practices. We can identify ways to assist state and localities. But it's an important moment here to kind of realize that there are vulnerabilities, and there are examples, by the way, that have been set by states around the country that we're going to encourage other states to take a close look at, like Rhode Island, like Virginia, like Michigan, like California, who have put together kind of pretty comprehensive and solid cyber approaches, and we would encourage every state to do that. But it's in the nature of our system that there are going to be, certain functions that are going to be the responsibility of state and localities.
I would only add that the best practice is absolutely essential to get those out. And second, typically the way we handle programs that have huge state constitutional responsibilities is to make it optional to state, resources optional, but encourage them dramatically. And this is one of those issues, I think, when it comes to security of cyber, particularly security of elections, where I don't see a lot of states saying, I'm not going to take the money from Washington, I'm not going to take the guidance from Washington. I think this is one they'll find saying, hey, help us, and, you know, because we want a system that's running correctly and without being subverted. So I think that's a difference than some other more controversial issues we deal with.
Particularly in the face of, you know, again, we'll see what the attribution ends up, but potentially in the face of possible foreign manipulation of elections, right? You know, I do think that it's a wake-up call for state and localities to look at best practices, to look at the vulnerabilities of those assets, those election systems, to classify those as critical and crown jewel assets that need to be protected. It's an extraordinary thing, you know, in the United States here, what we could be seeing, right? Which is the, you know, potential interference in a U.S. national election by a foreign power, which is a significant issue. As the senator said, should concern every governor in state and locality with respect to every election official, who should be looking for best practices and identifying vulnerabilities.
Another question.
Yes, is consideration being given to moving crucial computer systems from Windows to either Unix or Linux? And if not, why not, given the inherent security advantages of Unix?
I don't know if I heard the...
I think the question, if I characterize it right, is there any consideration being given moving government computer assets from Windows to Linux or another more secure operating system?
That's beyond my technical capability. I do think, though, that I think that one issue which I can't comment on that we're focused on, which is the issue of legacy systems and investment plans. The federal government obviously is it's like the state and local governments, right? You know, the federal government consists of many departments and agencies. The current structure and idea has been for each of those departments and agencies to be responsible for their own cybersecurity. My own judgment is that we need to have much more centralized help with respect. I mean, I don't think it's really going to be the case that you can ask every department agency in the government to develop for itself, particularly for smaller agencies, a 21st century cybersecurity system, defense system. That's not going to happen. And I think that we're looking at ways to try to get that, to try to ensure that we have more kind of centralized help and best practice help. With respect to legacy systems, this is an investment issue, right? And we have throughout the federal government, and you all in this room deal with them all throughout the defense industry, right? You know, we have systems that were put in place a long time ago, and because they're legacy systems, they are less able to be protected with modern cybersecurity technologies. And we do need, and we'll be talking about, an investment plan going forward to try to update and replace those systems to get them up to at least the speed where they can onboard the best kinds of cybersecurity. With respect to specific software, I can't comment really in an informed way.
My last experience with software was coding in BASIC in 1967 on cards with a pencil at West Point. But since I'm a senator, I can comment on that. I think I'll stop right there.
I was waiting for the insight.
Sure.
Hi, gentlemen. First of all, hi, my name is Jacob Sylvia. I work for the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. Thank you guys so much for coming here. I work cybersecurity, so this was great to hear. My question is kind of about something you guys touched on earlier. And I wanted to thank Senator Reed for saying that economic strength is the source of military strength, because I think it leads into my point relatively well. And realizing that attribution is difficult, and I mean, I deal with it every day, and I'm sure a lot of our people here do as well. Given the recent breaches by nation states and things like that, and the fact that 18 million Americans, government contractors and government civilians were hacked by China and the OPM and that breach, at what point does a nation-state-driven cyber attack garner the same type of response as an actual kinetic attack?
Well, I would just say that's one of those profound questions that we're all wrestling with right now. Tom on the commission, the members of the Senate, the Congress, the White House, and it is hugely complicated. And I'll just sort of, in a way, it reminds me of the kind of the evolution of deterrence theory and nuclear strategy after World War II. We suddenly had a weapon system with massive destructive capabilities, which we had to somehow manage, and it took several years to try to evolve a strategy, you know, the triad, to make redundant systems, maintaining constant 24-hour presence in the air so we wouldn't be trapped on the ground. And we're at that same sort of juncture right now in terms of cyber. How do we what's our offensive capabilities? What's our deterrent capabilities? And one of the issues, too, is that, you know, the Russian and the Chinese are not the only states that are out there doing things. There are other states, some of which we have relationships, which are doing things. And so you've got to be careful about, if you have a fixed rule that no one can violate, what happens when someone who we have a relationship with does it also? What do we do then? So I just think and I honestly admit, we are at this rudimentary stage of thinking clearly about the threats, what's our strategy, and one of the key points you identified quite clearly is we have a pretty clear, and this evolved over centuries, notion of what is a kinetic act of war. You cross a border, you fire a device at something, and we're still trying to figure out in the realm of cyber, what is that decisive, irreversible act that has to be retaliated against? And some of it is the nature of cyber. You know, for centuries, we've had espionage activities which are clearly designed to interfere with us to gain, and we tolerate might be too strong a word, but we do it, they do it, et cetera. It's not an act of war. It's certainly a threat against our country. It's an adverse act against us, but it's been sort of put into a category, this gray area. And so cyber has a lot of that characteristics too, which makes it a lot easier. I think one of Tom's points are, it would be, I think, a much different case, for example, if a major electric utility system in the United States were deliberately brought down, causing not only significant loss financially, but perhaps even the loss of life. That's a whole different situation. And we're just trying to wrestle, and it's tough wrestling to try to come up with what's the doctrine, what's the policy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I'd think of on three categories, right? Because it really is the fundamental question, right? The first category, as the Senator was saying, is doctrine, and you have a continuum from espionage to theft, forced entry, all the way up to destructive, right, activities and kinetic activities, which has typically been seen when carried out by a nation state as an act of war. And I do think that there is a pretty strong application of the physical laws of war to cyber that we can work through, and we are working through. But I think that's the continuum that the senator laid out, right? And attribution is difficult, as you said, in this space, but we do have, I think, a way of thinking about it, and it really is kind of how you move to kind of kinetic destructive activity by a nation state. That's kind of category one. The second of these norms that the Senator talked about, which I do think is an effort that we should put a lot more energy behind, particularly with like-minded nations. What's on, what's not on, right? What would be categorized as an attack, right? What should we agree to, right? For example, that if a country engaged in a cyber activity that would destroy a critical infrastructure, the Senator said a grid down, would that would seem to feel like a kinetic act of war by a nation state. And I think the third category is deterrence. So it's a doctrine, norms, and deterrence. And on the deterrence side, we have some things to learn, I think, from the nuclear, nuclear thinking. But it really is about raising the price right, for an action, deterring by making it much more costly than the benefit that can be gotten from the attack. But this is not something our commission's been working on, but this whole issue of deterrence, I think, is a really important current and next focus for thinking about cyber. How do we raise the cost to doing that, whether it's through name and shame, sanctions, other things that can be done back, right, by the country as we would in a wartime setting. So I think those are the right questions, still in flux, but I think those are the general categories, at least as I've been thinking about it.
We've got time for one more question, and I don't want my chair position to disenfranchise this whole half of the room. So do we have a question from over here that we could grab?
Thank you for the excellent panel, Matt Leary. My question is on the more subtle attacks or influence we might see from social media. We know that there are bad actors now working to influence certain areas in Europe through social media or very covert ways through social media. Is that part of some of the recommendations you're going to make to the next administration to take the anti-propaganda aspects into cyber? Or how can people in the room learn a little bit more about what we should be doing in that side of the more subtle cyber attacks?
Well, okay, that's not a focus of the commission. We're focused basically on the digital economy aspects of cyber and kind of the fundamental ways in which we can enhance cybersecurity in the government and throughout the country's economy. With respect to, but the point's a strong point, right? As we talked about. We do have nation states, I think, and the Russians are actively engaged in manipulation of the discussion and debate of issues in Europe, for example, in the political realm. I don't think there's any doubt about that now, and I think it's part of the effort that they have underway to try to gain advantage. I think one of the things, obviously, I think it's a principal Russian strategy at this point, which is to try to enhance fragmentation in Europe, at the same time when we actually need more unity in Europe with respect to solving a number of the problems they have on migration and terrorism and other things. So it's a significant issue, not one that we're kind of digging into in a big way in the commission now. In the war fighting and counterterrorism realm, the digital space has become as important as the physical space. We will, over time, defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And I think, and the Senate obviously oversees these efforts. I think we've made substantial progress, frankly, on kind of the on-the-ground war-fighting aspect of that counterterrorism effort. But this organization, ISIS, is very technically savvy, right, and has become a phenomenon because even if it is defeated on the ground, it'll help a lot, right? It also presents a digital space, a threat, and one that we have to combat, just as we have to combat them on the ground in Syria. And I think it's a big focus with respect to our counterterrorism efforts. Third, with respect to kind of core cybersecurity. I think companies, I think, do have really quite serious vulnerabilities with respect to reputation and other aspects of their business on social media, and it's something obviously that bears close attention.
I think one of the aspects that Tom has highlighted is particularly our struggle against radical jihadists. Is that we have found, this has been a sort of a learning process for us, and very ironic since we're the folks that invented Madison Avenue, and yet we've been, frankly, for a long time, out-advertised, out-hyped by people who have sort of a medieval view of the world. I think part of that is because we have agencies with resources like DOD, but the responsibility is elsewhere, in state, for example, and they don't have the resources, so we have a problem, and it's our problem to reallocate responsibilities and resources for a more coherent approach. The other issue, too, is that looking at some of these issues, particularly when it comes to our intelligence agency, we have restrictions on their ability to generate messages that go in the United States, Well, guess what? When you're on social media, you are worldwide. And there's an inhibition on what some of our agencies can do because they can't get up and say things if they will reach an American audience. We have to begin legislatively and in a policy dimension, think through how do we change that, do we change that? So we have some real challenges in terms of getting ahead of the opposition, and we have to do it because ISIS, I think, eventually will, through the military pressure, many other things, will be degraded significantly. But this phenomenon of social media, of political actors, whether or not they have a military agenda, trying to disrupt and dissuade and do all those things will continue. So we have some internal reorganization, and that's not the subject of Tom's commission so much, but that's something that the White House, the next administration particularly, working with Congress, our committees, has to look at seriously and deal with seriously.
Yeah, I think information warfare aspects, right? Have become, because of the prevalence of cyber in our lives, have become, I think, kind of a front and center challenge for us. And as the senator said, we have prohibitions in the United States and the United States government engaging in propaganda, right, domestically. But this is a big focus. We've seen it with respect to ISIS. I think we will increasingly see this in Europe and elsewhere around the world with respect to Russia. And you've seen it, in China. Right now, the government of China, the principal strategic goal of the Chinese government, where we have, President Xi, who has undertaken enormously big challenges on reform and other things, and has become the most powerful leader in China since Mao. The principal strategic goal there is to preserve the monopoly of power for the Communist Party of China. Right, and an important part of that we've seen is information control. If you're a U.S. company now, moving into to do business in China, and you do content online, that's now being regulated very heavily by the Chinese. So you see information aspects of those efforts as well. Online information has become a real focus in a number of dimensions. It's a good question.
We've got to leave it there, unfortunately. Mr. Donilon, the SENEDIA has a tradition of presenting a coin as a commemoration and a remembrance for you of your visit here to Newport. So I present this to you, and I say thank you for your service to the country and for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Jack Reed, Mr. Tom Donilon.